Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. Today is Tuesday, February 20th. This is the 137th day since the attacks by Hamas on South Israel. A Hamas official told Haaretz, the newspaper in Israel, that Hananiah's visit to Cairo is not a sign of breakthroughs in terms of the hostage talks. So meetings in Cairo have been continuing. You may recall that the Israelis have not sent delegates to those meetings. But Ismail Hananiah, who is the head of the political arm of Hamas, who's been staying in Qatar, is in Cairo or is going to be in Cairo to continue work on the potential for negotiations. We do know that Hamas has been uncompromising in terms of demanding that any ceasefire or pause, even if it's incremental, would ultimately lead to Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And so those conversations are continuing, again, without Israel's participation. The Israeli army announced the death of a soldier from wounds sustained in Gaza in the last 24 hours. These are some highlights from Haaretz. And the Israeli Defense Forces released footage of the kidnapped Babas family in Gaza. I talked about that a little bit yesterday. Israel struck a weapons depot in Lebanon, so things have been continuing to escalate at the southern border of Lebanon and the northern border of Israel. And I'll give more updates ahead about what's happening at the United Nations in terms of the potential for a draft resolution calling for what the U.S. is calling a temporary ceasefire. It's quite significant because it's the first time the U.S. is using the term ceasefire. So our efforts are slowly moving the needle. So do not be discouraged in that regard. A cargo ship was forced to evacuate after Houthi missiles, after a Houthi missile attack. The Houthis, again, are in Yemen. The British-owned cargo ship was at risk of sinking after one of the most damaging attacks yet by Houthis off the coast of Yemen. The Houthis are Iranian-backed, are a militia. They've been attacking ships in the Red Sea in protest of Israel's war in Gaza. And the U.S., Britain have struck Houthi targets, but as of yet, it seems that it's failed to deter them. So I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about a New York Times article that came out this morning or in the last day or so. It's by David Leonhardt. He talks about three questions right now in the big picture of what's happening in Gaza. The thing we're paying attention to is Netanyahu's government and is the Israeli Defense Forces, are they going to move forward in terms of a full-on ground invasion into Rafah, the southernmost city at the end of Gaza? So Israel's war is both a military operation against Hamas, but it's also being fought by controlling food, water, gas, electricity into Gaza. So Leonhardt talks about in his article things that are simultaneously true. He says to defeat a violent enemy, Israel may need to invade Rafah, but an invasion of Rafah would most certainly worsen the war's awful civilian toll. So the United States has been opposed to it unless there is a plan to safely evacuate what now is more than 1 million people in South Gaza. Displaced people from the enclave. So the three questions this article seeks to answer is: what does Israel hope to accomplish by invading? What are its goals? What might forestall an invasion? It seems that the U.S. has impacted that a bit because we've been hearing about this now for more than a week, if not a couple of weeks. How might the civilian toll be reduced if an invasion happens? So the first thing, Israel's goals. His goal is eliminating Hamas. And there was a thought that maybe that would mean, getting rid of the head of the military wing, or maybe that would be caveated. Eliminating Hamas might mean taking them out of control of Gaza. But Netanyahu has been uncompromising. Eliminating Hamas means the eradication of Hamas. That's what he's been saying since the beginning of the war. Some Israelis are challenging the government and saying that the government should be prioritizing on the release of the hostages. But there is a possibility that an invasion of Rafah, according to this analysis, could debilitate Hamas, could significantly limit their military capabilities at a minimum. Can it be avoided? So the most likely path for avoiding an invasion, according to this New York Times article, would be an extended ceasefire in exchange for the remaining hostages. The New York Times says there's about 130. We've heard that there's about 100 that are believed to still be alive. That number might be smaller than that. The exchange of hostages could mean also the exchange of bodies that have already died. But if the hostages are returned, or if there's a temporary pause or ceasefire, that could delay the invasion. But there are impediments to the deal. Hamas is saying they want an absolute promise and assurance that if the hostages are released, that ultimately Israel will leave as an enclave. Netanyahu has been uncompromising and say it's a non-starter. So it seems that negotiations are at an impasse. And finally, point number 3 is the protection of civilians. If Israel does invade, officials around the world have called on it to protect the civilians in Rafah. Now, we've been hearing this since the beginning of the war on Gaza. We've been hearing verbal demands that civilians be protected. And I'll talk in a minute about the death toll, which, is at roughly 30,000 people killed. It's more than 29,000 people killed and 65 plus thousand injured. I heard a statistic this week that says the death toll of children is now 11,500 children, October 7th. So how might civilians be protected is the question if this invasion happens. Most analysts are saying it's not possible. There's nowhere for them to go without them being displaced into Egypt. So there have been concerns this past week about the building of a wall south of Rafah, which could be to allow for people to be able to relocate there. And the concern is if that happens, that it could be a permanent relocation into the Sinai. Even Egypt, the United States, and others have been completely opposed to that. The Biden administration has expressed frustration that Netanyahu does not have a clear plan for protecting civilians, which is talking about how they would not support an invasion unless there's a plan. So those are some of the key issues being considered. I mentioned yesterday that Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, wrote his ambassador to Israel. They're having a diplomatic dispute over some comments that he made, comparing some of what's happening in Gaza to some of the actions during the Holocaust. So that continues to be an issue. And then at the United Nations, Algeria has a resolution that was supposed to go to a vote today. It could be delayed because the United States is also negotiating a UN Security Council resolution that's proposing a temporary ceasefire as soon as practicable is the language. The draft resolution from the US would be competing with Algeria, but the US resolution comes with several caveats, but the word ceasefire does appear for the first time, which, according to the New York Times, reflects President Biden's shift toward criticisms of Israel's prosecution of the war and its planned offensive into the southern Gaza city of Rafah. So it talks about how a ground invasion would harm civilians, could also displace them, which of course the US and many others oppose. And Egypt has refused as of yet to let Palestinians, other than those who are sick and need medical care, flee into its territory. So those are some of the conditions of the UN resolution. On Sunday, the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said that if the Algerian resolution goes forward for a vote, the United States is expecting to veto. It's important to note the US is the only member of the Security Council to have twice voted against resolutions calling for a ceasefire. These resolutions are legally binding by members of the UN, even though many countries, or at least some, ignore them. There's no enforcement mechanism, but sanctions can be used to penalize violators if resolutions are passed. So that is quite significant. I think that is what I wanted to share about the United Nations. There is an update actually about UNRA, the UN Refugee Agency. There have been accusations that some of their staff were involved in the October 7th attacks, which the director of UNRA, Philip Lazzarini, has been taking very seriously. They immediately fired those who were accused, even though there was no evidence. And Lazzarini came out with a statement. He's been in his office for 4 years, and he reiterated two messages through interviews with Israeli news sources. He said, first, that they are not aware, he and others are not aware of any involvement of UNRWA employees in terrorist activities before these suspicions were brought to his attention. And second, he repeated that the agency acts to prevent Hamas from infiltrating its ranks, and it takes Israel's claims seriously. I did have a briefing with our board last week from the U.S. head of UNRWA, and we heard firsthand about how sometimes UNRWA schools are abandoned and then they are used as a military depot. And so sometimes in the news, we'll see UNRWA school used as a depot. And he said, but those are not active schools. And so it wasn't, it was really interesting to get the briefing about how UNRWA, in terms of their PR, in terms of what you hear in the news, so many things I heard directly from this briefing are just not being communicated more broadly. And it's important to remember UNRWA is the #1 agency delivering aid in Gaza right now. Two other final points. Is one, there are concerns now. When I was on the ground in Jerusalem, we were hearing, because the high holy seasons for Muslims, Jews, and Christians don't overlap this year, we were hearing that there wasn't much concern about Ramadan. But Israeli news is starting to report significant concerns because Netanyahu, prime minister, backed the far-right demand to limit the number of Arab Israeli worshippers at the Al-Aqsa, the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, during Ramadan. So age restrictions, residential areas will be a determining factor. And so this is Netanyahu acquiescing to far-right ministers in Israel, and there are significant concerns that this and the presence and provocation of far-right ministers could also provoke the response, the concern of clashes. Ramadan starts Sunday, March 10th. this year. And so we'll be paying close attention to that. And finally, Ramallah and President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority are calling on the United States to back the PA as a member state at the United Nations. So that was also reported that the PA's prime minister, that's Prime Minister Shataya, we met with him in January, said that it is prepared to cooperate with Hamas, provided that the latter accepts preconditions, which could be the rehabilitation, it could be conditions can mean a lot of different things. So that's a significant update. Pray for those who are on the Gaza ceasefire pilgrimages right now, and may our calls and prayers and efforts towards a ceasefire be fruitful. That is our hope, and that is our prayer.